welcome back for those of you that were here yesterday with us for our 2 presentations, and then welcome for those who are new. This is the Public Land Grazing 101, a multi-state discussion how to start and build a public land grazing program. I'm Kelsey Virgin. I'm a project manager with the Pasture Project at the Wallace Center. I'm hosting the series along with Mary C. Anderson from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Thanks, Mary C. And if you're just joining us today, a little bit of how we got here today. Pasture Project has been working with the Wisconsin DNR since 2014 on helping them build up their grazing program. And part of that work, we did lots of interviews with stakeholders across the Midwest region and found this critical need for technical assistance and support on the nuts and bolts of grazing on public land. Originally, we wanted to have everybody gathered together in person at an active grazing site, but given COVID, we pivoted to do an online series through Regain, the online community of practice platform. If you haven't already, we saw that some of you did sign up yesterday for Regain, which is great. We do encourage you to do so. There is a discussion group associated with this series where if you have questions that didn't get answered today, or you think of other things, want to connect with peers, problem solving, the discussion group is a great way to share photos and other documents and just kind of troubleshoot amongst peers. And we will send a link later to if you need one to sign up for Regain. Okay, so that is all my logistics for today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, which is Greg Horner, who is going to be discussing public land grazing outside the Midwest. Greg has worked in the environmental field for 25 years at the intersection of environment, agriculture, and sustainability for 17 years. He currently wears 2 hats. One as an independent consultant. He works with foundations, nonprofits, mission-aligned companies, and individual donors, providing them with strategy development, research, impact assessment, and program implementation. His clients include the McKnight Foundation, Patagonia, Tomcat Ranch, a startup nonprofit, an individual donor, and Ammonia LLC. Greg is the lead author of recently released series of profiles on public land managers who are using regenerative grazing as a tool to achieve their conservation goals. In addition to his consulting work, Greg is the senior program officer at the Cedar Tree Foundation in Boston, where he has worked since 2004. His recent work includes the design and implementation of a $15 million funding initiative focused on the intersection of climate change, soil health, and regenerative grazing. He also manages a varied portfolio of grants, including those related to energy extraction on native lands, urban agriculture, environmental education, environmental justice, and more. So we're very excited to have you here, Greg. Thanks for taking time out of your day to present to us and share your expertise. And I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I had the great fortune to have this research project funded by a couple of great foundations who are interested in promoting grazing, and here today to share some of what I learned from that. So this project was incredibly interesting and inspiring, in large part because I got to interview agency staff like yourselves. In this case, it was agency staff who are using grazing to achieve their management goals, as well as often their grazing partners, the individuals with the animals, sometimes nonprofit or research partners also. I learned about their challenges, their successes, their stories, their concerns. And I asked them all, like, what would be your advice for other agency staff who are interested, who might be interested in using grazing? So I have some quotes to share from them and some takeaways. So my role today is to share some of what I learned from this project and some examples from around the country. I'll note at the outset that this is not a data-focused endeavor. We didn't set out to do a white paper or exhaustive research. We chose to do relatable stories about specific places and people and their experiences and the wisdom they have to share with others. So if you're looking for a white paper, keep looking. So before we dive into specific examples, I will ask you, what do these have in common? An off-road vehicle park, a wildlife refuge, a pipeline corridor, and a former bombing range. These are all public lands where grazing is being used as the best tool to achieve the management goals. And these are some of the sites that I profiled for the project that I'm talking about today. That's Max Alliger with the Missouri Department of Conservation. Some of you know him, I'm sure. Lowry Ranch with the wildflowers That's part of the Colorado State Lands Board. You'll be hearing more about that. The bottom right is a Bureau of Land Management oil drilling pad that was highly impacted, shall we say, and restored with goats in Wyoming, like crazy amount of goats. Not really going to talk about that project, but it is one of the profiles. And then the Land Rover is from a off-road vehicle park in California where grazing is used to reduce fire risk. The intersection of off-road vehicles and intensive grazing. So here's a little view into some of the profiles. There are 8 of them. Each one's about 8 pages long. So we went for quality over quantity, I suppose. I could have written more, didn't have enough funding to do more. Each one has quotes and photos and sections on monitoring and successes and why they're using grazing. So I'm happy to talk more about how this project came about and who funded it and the process, but I'll leave most of that for the Q&A so that we can focus on the results here. So I think that's really what's most relevant for all of you. I want to give a shout out to Wisconsin DNR for their work with the Pasture Project. That was one of the inspirations for this effort. And I learned a lot from them that informed the rest of this project. So I'm grateful to them and to all the others who shared their time with me to inform these profiles. I looked all across the US for examples of public land grazing projects that met just a few parameters. The bar was set pretty low. They had to be in operation for at least 2 years, and they had to be planning to continue with their grazing. They were somehow measuring their impact, and they were not using a continuous grazing model. Oops, that's the wrong direction. There we go. We eventually found more projects than we could write about, as well as a bunch of others that were new or emerging. So we deliberately selected a varied group from multiple states with different precipitation levels, acreage, management goals, grazing methods, even agency types, to try to give many people something to relate to or connect with. So we have, these are the sites I profiled. My partner also wrote a series of private land profiles, and they're all visible on the website landandmanagement.com. So I'm going to share some specific highlights and then some takeaways from the project as a whole. I have a little video in the middle to kind of break it up so you don't have to just listen to me for half an hour. I'll note that we have 20 minutes of Q&A planned at the end, but you know, we're a pretty small group. I'd say feel free to ask questions, write them in the chat as we go, especially if there are clarifying questions along the way. We can try to address those as we go. And I'll rely on others to handle the chat. Much appreciated. Great, so diving into one of the profiles. This is a ranch in Colorado. I'd say it's one of the most impressive stories from the bunch. It's a 25,000 acre ranch owned by the Colorado State Lands Board. I don't think this is common in the Midwest, but a bunch of the Western states have these lands boards where big allotments of land was given to them that they can spin revenue off of to support public schools and other things. So the state has a mandate. It's like by legislation, they're required to optimize their income from these sites. And this site was using grazing. And after years of poor grazing conditions and really degraded land, the ranch was given 7 years of rest. Like, all right, just give it some time off and it'll come back. But it showed no recovery during that time. So they tried to do a new approach. 5 years ago, they switched. The State Lands Board worked with some consultants and switched to a focus on soil health and year-round adaptive planned grazing. And the results were very convincing. This on the bottom left is William Woolston of the Colorado State Land Board, and Nick Trainer is the contract grazer who was selected through an RFP process. and has a 10-year contract. They both cited the long contract as being really important for enabling the grazing partner to invest in a long-term plan and a business and infrastructure. Really, his business is mostly built around this site and this partnership. They develop a grazing plan, and they use short grazing periods of 4 to 12 days and long recovery periods of 60 to 90 days in the riparian zone and 120 to 300 days in the upland areas. And they were careful to point out that they recognized it would be somewhat controversial to say that they're grazing in the riparian zone, but they found that with a very judicious and sort of precision approach, they were able to see some good benefits from doing that. So this is a little screenshot from one of the profiles. On the right here, we have icons showing some of the benefits, and then a quote that it earns them money. I know finances is often an issue for agencies, and coming up with a proposal that's going to add costs can be harder. I'm going to talk more about the financial implications later, but they were clear that it's a financial win for them, that their soil health focus has led to increased revenue. It's enhanced biodiversity and wildlife, it's improved forage, to the point where they've increased the size of their herd. They have 600 cattle grazing year-round here. Invasive species have been reduced. Native grasses and forbs have been increased. They've only been at this for a few years. That's one of the most impressive parts, is how quickly there was change. I have some more quotes from the people involved in this project later on in the presentation about that. The ranch manager, the contract grazer, I should say, told me that their grazing season now starts a month earlier than their neighbors and ends a month later because of the health of their soil. He attributes it to not only the soil health, but also to capturing 100% of the rainfall. And this has allowed them to get through droughts without destocking at times when their neighbors have had to. Another site out in California, a national wildlife refuge. This was one of the only federal sites. Most of the places I found were state level sites, in part due to NEPA permitting requirements that were on the federal sites that just made everything difficult. So on the left, this is Bree Owens, contract grazer on the wildlife refuge, and Joe Silvera, the refuge manager who works for the state, or I guess the feds, it's a national refuge. They both stressed the need for a good relationship and for regular communication. Bree is one of 4 local ranchers that the refuge works with to get the desired impact on the site. She was selected through an RFP process. They start with a 1-year trial period, and then they use rolling 3-year agreements. This site has used planned grazing, or has prescribed planned grazing since 1991, and they graze around 3,000 acres over 2 different grazing periods. They'll have like 2-month period, and then a break, and then another 2-month window. All of that is aligned with seasonal flooding of the site and with the life cycle of wildlife and wildflowers. And it's adaptive, so it's often shifting. They don't know exactly when flooding is going to come, and they have to sometimes pull the herd off with rather short notice. And that just goes back to the need for communication. I can't see or hear anyone, so it's really weird to be giving a presentation. Are people out there? I hope. It's just a bunch of names and boxes, but I'm just going to carry on. Hopefully we're good. So Joe and Bree are very clear that this approach saves them money and improves their wildflowers and wildlife, including game species. They have multiple research papers that have shown the benefits of grazing here, including for biodiversity. And this is one of several sites that I profiled that use grazing to reduce fire risk, especially by controlling the shrubs that can be ladder fuels for what would otherwise just be a low grass fire. the shrubs can help the fire reach up to higher, become a big fire instead of just a little grass fire. Also, by keeping more green grass and less dry, sort of senescing grasses, the fires are less intense. I'll note that Joe's contact information is in the profiles, along with all the other people I interviewed. And the intention there was any of you can just go to these profiles and contact these people. And I'm sure they're all glad to connect with any of you. That was kind of the expectation along with being part of this. So let's see here. Yeah, some of the quotes from Joe and Bree talking about the benefits, and Joe especially, he doesn't want to have cattle on the site year round. And that's true for most of these sites. They have cattle or whatever livestock they're using, mostly cattle, only for a little bit of the year, only for a short window. Usually it's at least a month. Most of them are not more than a few months. There's a couple that have longer term, like Lowry Ranch is year round. That was the one I talked about previously in Colorado. Let's see.
One quick question for you, Greg.
Yeah.
How did the project to do these interviews, how did that come to be, and how much time did it take to find funding to do a project such as?
So I think you were breaking up a little on me, but I think it was, how did this project come to be, and how long did it take to find funding to do this? So let's see. I knew about the work of Wisconsin DNR, and through talking with a partner out at Tomcat Ranch in California. She knew of another project out there, which is Hollister Hills, which is actually the slide right here. And we had those two examples, and we knew there had to be more. And we started scheming about how could we raise the visibility? How could we promote more grazing on public lands, because it seemed to be working so well on these sites. And I would say more adaptive grazing on public lands. And so, yeah, we started hunting around, figured out no one else had done this, and started collecting suggestions. The longest part of it was there were a lot of dead ends. A lot of, okay, this site looks really good. And then you talk to them like, well, we're just starting, or we don't have any data, or a variety of reasons why it wasn't going to work out. But I got to talk to a lot of people and learned a lot. The funding part was in some ways easy, in some ways hard. As a consultant, I work somewhat in the funding space, so I had some good contacts there, which already helped. My partner from Tomcat Ranch also, they're a foundation, and they had other contacts. So together we sort of pieced it together. And McKnight Foundation was one of the funders, which was great. And Piscinus, the No Regrets Initiative in California also. I'm forgetting, there was at least one more. Hopefully that answers the question. Happy to iterate more on that now or in the Q&A. So here's the, as I was saying, Hollister Hills is in California, near the coast, sort of mid-state. I got to visit this site and met with Scott Soares on the left, who works with the State Parks and Rec, and Joe Morris, who's the contract grazer who's been grazing at this park since 1994. And I asked Scott for tips to share with other agency staff who are considering using grazing. I did that with everybody. So these were his tips about demonstrating specific goals to make the case, measuring your success on a long-term scale, and then the partnership. And I'll talk more about that in the takeaways, the value of the partnership and communication. And he specifically put a point on, not just telling the grazer what you think should be done, telling them what your goals are, so they can become a partner to you and understand what you're trying to achieve, and really help you to achieve those goals. especially with an adaptive framework where the conditions are always changing. If they understand your goals, they can use that to help influence their decisions in the field on a day-to-day basis.
Greg, there's another question for you in the chat box, which is what kind of water access is there at the Sacramento River Refuge? Is it the river itself?
No, if I recall, it's a little fuzzy because there were a whole bunch of these. I talked to them, over a year ago. If I recall, there were some sites that had access from the water where they could pump from the water. Other times, I think there was some trucking involved of water. I don't have a great answer on that. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So this is a slide I stole from another presentation, but this is still about Joe Morris, who's the grazer on the Hollister Hills Park in California. Over 20 years, they've reduced the amount of bare ground on this site by 60 to 90%, which means more forage, more productivity, and better for wildlife. They were able to, as a result, increase their stocking capacity by 200%, while also improving wildlife habitat and health. Grazing's also reduced the risk of fire. Obviously, we're in California here. It's a different situation than the Midwest for fire, but the neighbors all around this park were really concerned about fire. So grazing was a solution that they came up with and proposed when this park was first designated. The use of adaptive grazing has increased the resilience of this land and made Joe Morris's business more profitable. And he does contract grazing, where he brings in cattle, only has them for some months, and then moves them on to into Nevada, I believe, to different grazing grounds. Anyway, the agency also gives them a discounted lease because of their long-term commitment and the work trade system they have developed with Joe, such as some invasive species removal and fencing and water work. That was common in these profiles, is in the interviews, was some sort of work trade agreement.
Are you ready for another question before your video?
Sure, yeah, bring it.
Question is, you use the term adaptive grazing. How is this different or the same as rotational grazing, or how would you define adaptive grazing?
Good question. We were really, we didn't want to impose a set definition across these profiles because they're all different. They have different approaches, different landscapes. To me, the difference is rotational grazing implies a very simple kind of, we're going to divide up our system like this, and we're going to move it from here to here to here to here, maybe on a set schedule. At least that's what the name implies, that you're rotating like you are like on a clock or something. The term adaptive grazing reinforces the idea that these are landscapes, they're natural processes. Every year is different. There's droughts, there's floods, and that the grazer and the manager needed to be adaptive. They needed to design their plans to be able to be flexible based on what's happening on the ground. And so that was a big part of the importance of having a good relationship and the importance of having open and easy communication, to enable that kind of adaptive management. Hopefully that answered the question. A little bit of a fuzzy definition, but I think it's a good start. Why don't we watch this short video, which is about the Missouri Department of Conservation and one of their sites. They were also profiled, although I don't have much in here about it. I was trying to bring in examples from further afield. Anyway, here we go.
You can talk about threatened and endangered species. But what about the loss of entire habitat that supports thousands of living things? That's the tallgrass prairie. Once it covered about 170 million acres across America. Now only about 10% of that remains. In Missouri, the percentage is even less. We think we have about 0.5% of our native tallgrass prairie remaining. But Missouri has some of the best examples of what still exists, and it's crucial that we protect it.
The best of Missouri's remaining tall grass prairie is found in Harrison County's Grand River grasslands. The Missouri Department of Conservation considers it a priority geography. This treasured remnant occupies a small area of Missouri and Iowa, about a third the size of an average county. But it's vastly important. Plants include a foundation of native warm season grasses. Forbs sprinkle the prairie, flowering to produce abundant food for wildlife. A special mix of birds, animals, and arthropods depends on this critical ecosystem. Missouri and Iowa cooperate to conserve and enlarge the Grand River grasslands. On the Missouri side, the Department of Conservation, the Nature Conservancy, Missouri master naturalists, landowners, and prairie enthusiasts work to buy, restore, and expand remaining tall grass prairie. Woody plants that encroach and threaten grasslands are controlled through sustainable modern practices like controlled burning and grazing. And a growing collaboration between agencies and ranchers advances the cause. You can experience this area in every season. MDC's Pawnee Prairie near Hatfield is a perfect example of the grassland's beauty and value. Close by, the Nature Conservancy's Dunn Ranch.
So yeah, Missouri Department of Conservation, they were a little bit of an outlier for our profiles. All the others are about one specific site. And with Missouri, they're using this across a whole bunch of different sites, the same approach. There wasn't one really standout kind of flagship site. So we just did a different kind of interview where it talks about their statewide approach, and in particular, their use of patch burn grazing instead of using fencing to, or in some cases, other places we're using range riders to move the animals. Instead of using fencing or horses to use the animals, they use burning. And the fresh green grasses, the tender sprouts, were what the animals congregated towards naturally. So that was how they spread out the animal impact. So yeah, some takeaways here as we sort of step back from the individual sites to the whole process and the overall. There were a lot of comments about relationships and trust and communication. One quote I remember from the beginning was that projects move at the speed of trust. That might have been someone from Wisconsin DNR, I believe. Aaron Grossman, I think, said that. Anyway, all the partners need to be involved and bought in, not just the decision makers. Finding the right match between agency staffer and grazing partner is essential. And they also talked about contracts and about the fact that if you have a system that requires selecting the highest bidder, that doesn't help. That makes it harder to find the right match. I did talk with them about the range of all the contracts and how they selected people, RFPs and bids and such. Nearly all were at least 3 years in duration. I liked the Sacramento approach where they had a 1-year trial period to do a test before they jumped into a 3-year lease. And I also liked that for them, it was a 3-year rolling lease. So after 2 years, they would decide on the next cycle that was it wasn't even ending yet. That way, if the lease was ending, everyone would have notice of a good long period. Yeah, communication was also cited a lot, and open, honest, frequent communication. I like to cite the example again with the Wisconsin DNR. They put up this big professionally made sign to inform neighbors and hikers and passersby about, hey, you know, we're grazing on the site, here's why, and it's very deliberate and prescriptive, and here are the benefits. People were supportive once they understood what was going on. And I think that aligns with what I heard throughout this process, was that the community liked what was happening. It was seen as positive, and in particular by supporting a local grazer, and the benefits for wildlife. No one cited any lawsuits or significant complaints. The opposite actually was true with multi-use sites in particular. I'll get to that. There was a huge range in the management goals that agency staff were citing for their use of grazing. Reducing fire risk, increasing wildflowers, restoring degraded land, protecting endangered species, promoting game birds for hunting, maximizing forage, quality and quantity for revenue. So there are many different reasons to use grazing. And importantly, grazing was often cited as the best tool and the most efficient tool for the job, whatever the job was among that list that I just mentioned. A few of my favorite quotes here: the patchy cover. Max Allinger is all about the patchy cover for birds to be able to have different habitats. I mentioned William Woolston and the State Lands Board. You know, he talks about it was a shocking and amazing thing to see. He's not the kind of guy prone to hyperbole, so that means a lot coming from him, to see that this change really happened quickly over just a few years. The BLM quote at the bottom there, this was about all I got out of the BLM. They were very challenging to work with. But they did admit that the intensive grazing was effective for reclamation of this oil pipeline. More quotes and some relevant takeaways. I'll note that there was no like recipe or model these people tended to be following. Most of them were innovating new systems to work with their needs. Hopefully their examples can inform some of your decisions and processes. As I mentioned earlier, most of the projects were state agencies. The federal folks cited challenges with NEPA permitting. Multi-use sites were common, which was the opposite of what I expected, really. But several people cited that their adaptive grazing enabled multiple uses more easily on the site, because the herd was only ever in a small part at any one time. Recreation was a commonly cited use that was that coincided well with grazing. And all the agency staff I interviewed said that grazing either saved them money or it didn't cost them anything extra. Some noted higher upfront costs and the expectation of savings over time, in part because of infrastructure costs and developing the systems. Saving money was cited as an important attribute for winning over skeptical supervisors. Wait a second. So along the same line of what I was saying, these kind of speak for themselves. Many different benefits. When I look at the 8 profiles, a lot of them, these are the most common themes. Water, a lot of it comes back to water. A lot of the goals related to soil health, building soil health in order to then support reduce bare ground or promote native plants or wildlife or resilience to floods and droughts. Almost to the end here, and wanted to just hit on some of the other themes and some of the methods that were cited a lot. One was a paradigm shift to thinking about grazing as a tool to help achieve management goals. One was adaptive grazing and adjusting plans as the grazing season unfolds based on weather and how the vegetation is responding. Some of these managers talked about, checking daily to see when they've had enough disturbance, the level of disturbance that they want from the herd, and then deciding, okay, now I think we've done it. We've gotten to knee height, or maybe half the vegetation is gone. Let's move the herd. That's sort of the opposite of having a fixed plan that you follow, such as moving the animals every 2 weeks or whatever. Some agencies were also using grazing to prepare sites for herbicide application. The cattle can graze down the surrounding grasses, making it easier for the herbicide to be applied to invasive weeds, thus reducing the amount of herbicide needed and the time needed for the application. Patch burn grazing, I talked about a little bit with Missouri as a method for moving the animals. I'll just move on from that. Fire control, we also talked about a bit, that grazing can reduce the intensity of the fire, reduce ladder fuels, and reduce the residual dry matter. I've seen sites where a burn, not a prescribed burn, a wild burn, would stop right at the edge of a grazed area because it just ran out of fuel. So I want to end by channeling the people that I interviewed to encourage anyone who's considering using grazing as a tool to not feel overwhelmed, to not be overwhelmed by the feeling that they need to transform everything right away or quickly. This is often an incremental process from what I hear, and we've seen impressive results come from simply beginning to inventory resources, to articulate goals, and to begin monitoring. That's all I've got. So let's go to your questions. People can unmute if they want to ask them, put them in the chat, whatever.
There is a question. There's a question here.
Certainly follow up with me as well. And one last thing is the website here, all the contact information for the people is available in the profiles there. Sorry, Mary.
Fantastic, Greg. Thank you so much. There is a question here that the information you're providing is qualitative. How do we address the issue for those who want it quantitated?
Yeah, as I stated at the outset, like that wasn't our approach. We chose to do stories, anecdotes, totally qualitative. We just hope that someone else is out there doing the research. Like, for example, Nature Conservancy has done a lot of research on some of their, the impact of some of their grazing on some of their properties. And I'm happy to share other research, but I feel like most of you are better adapted in the research section. And I believe the next speaker will also be talking about some of the quantitative.
Curious, Greg, if you could talk a little bit about, you touched on this about like the value of, signage and things like that, but can you talk a little bit about the value of like promoting your grazing program and how to like best market your grazing program? Like we saw the video. Is there any other ideas that you have or things that folks you talked to suggested?
It really felt like a lot of these people that I interviewed, and even some that I interviewed and did not become profiles, they weren't promoting. They weren't promoting their efforts. They weren't trying to point out their successes. And even some of them cited concern about, if I point out that we're using this new method and it's saving us money or we're generating revenue, then I'm afraid that we're going to get pressure to, reduce our budget or something. So they preferred to have it be kind of below the radar.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I didn't hear a lot about anyone really proactively trying to raise the visibility of their work. I think they were just, this is our site, this is my job, I'm doing my thing. It's not my role to be promoting this more broadly. Joe Morris, who's that guy from Hollister Hills with the state parks, he's got a couple of videos online from when he spoke at the Grass-Fed Exchange. Certainly there's that. I don't know about others. Missouri, I guess, is a leader in the Department of Conservation space, state level conservation in producing videos like the one we saw, and also research.
Yeah. Well, I think it speaks to the value of doing the kind of the case studies that you did, and also just helping kind of change mindsets both from the agency level and also the public user level and things like that to get the word out of the benefits of grazing and whatnot. Are there any other questions for Greg? You can put them in the chat. You should also feel free to unmute.
There's a question for any of the sites. Were any conventional agriculture methods used to jumpstart the process, or was it all primarily management? And I think this would be, did they do soil tests and do some corrective, or was it pretty much all animal agriculture impact on the habitat?
Great question. I'm going through my mental search here of the sites. And boy, there was very little mention of inputs. Certainly there were soil tests, baseline soil test being, and not just, baseline soil test being key, but also not just your standard extension soil tests. Like several places talked about wanting to get measures of respiration and soil biology, and infiltration is a really compelling one for as an indicator of soil health. Being able to track how your infiltration changes over time as a way to reflect the resilience of a site for reducing runoff and increasing infiltration. Boy, I know when I spoke with Max Alliger, he talked about the historical land use being such a significant driver of the future for decades or longer. That can be really challenging to kind of renovate land and sort of try to replicate pasture or native pasture, perennial pasture, I should say. But at least in Max's case and in several others, it was restored land. It was planted prairie. So that's certainly a modern agriculture approach. Boy, Lowry Ranch out in Colorado, that's the place that was a former bombing range. They still have like concrete missile silos from intercontinental ballistic missiles that are like capped there. So they certainly had plenty of disturbance there. But again, their primary approach was rest, which didn't work. And then they came in with really with a grazing focus and relied on the seed bank. The goat grazing one profile, which I didn't really speak about, that was all about, they did some seeding there, but mostly it was animal impact.
Were any of the sites using multi-species, like beef and sheep in the same paddock area at the same time?
If I'm not mistaken, I think that's called is that a flurd? A flock and a herd? Anyway, no, not the ones that I interviewed. They were pretty much all beef except for the goat grazing, which was a project on high elevation, highly rural BLM land on a very degraded pipeline corridor that Chevron actually wasn't allowed to give up their lease because the land was so degraded. They weren't allowed to retire the lease until they had restored grasses to the land. So they actually paid a lot of money to this goat grazing operation to spend multiple years bringing an intensive goat management to the site to restore grasses to the pipeline corridor. But that's not really your question, so.
Very interesting, though. That's very fascinating. Yeah. And Kent Solberg says, yes, it is called a flurd. So you were correct. Any other questions for Greg?
Greg, I'd just like to say this awesome presentation, really good information, and ask maybe if you could talk a little bit more. It seems like the three things that I run into when I talk to a public agency about grazing, and I've done a little bit with them over the years, but it always comes down to water, fencing, and liability issues. And I can't seem to get, and I'm in central Iowa is where I am. I can't seem to really get past liability as the biggest one. Has to be a legal fence, has to be this, you know, we got deep pockets and we can't afford lawsuits, I guess is what it is, you know? But if you could talk about those three things a little bit more, maybe.
Liability, fencing, and water. Yeah, happy to. Before I do that, I will say I hope that you are in touch with the people at Practical Farmers of Iowa. My colleague and friend there, Megan Filbert, is a great resource, and I believe they've been talking at some point with some agencies about trying to break down barriers for grazing on some of the public lands. I also know
I've done a lot of
that,
work. I've done a lot of work with Megan.
oh, great, good. I figured you'd already found her. You know, it's interesting that you bring up liability. That is not a word that came up that I recall at any of the conversations I had. But it makes total sense that it would come up. Water was something we talked about a lot, and fencing somewhere in the middle, a decent amount. And I would say I have the most information on water, and that's not even that's a lot. There's more details in the profiles. I can't access all of it in my brain, but I know the Wisconsin folks talked a lot about needing to install watering systems, and that really their biggest headaches were caused by water systems that weren't working properly. And I think they started off with like a gravity fed system and then went to a pump system, and they installed a pump that could push the water in like for a long ways in almost any direction, so they could move the hoses around based from one central pump. Other sites, yeah, the need for water infrastructure is key, and that's a major expense that's at the outset. But that's what you have to have if you're going to move the livestock around a lot. Some places would use the water as a way to move the animals because they knew they would stay near the watering source. Others would use like with Colorado, the Lowry Ranch in Colorado, they would use some of their riparian grazing, and they would schedule that in to provide water access to different sections of the river. But they also had a lot of water infrastructure for the upland sites, and that was just something that had to be designed in at the start, and big upfront expense. The goat program, that's really kind of an outlier, so they just had trucks of water. The Hollister Hills, I think they've got some pipes that run water to that sort of autofill as the water level drops. Yeah, there are a bunch of different ways of doing it, and certainly some of them have solar systems. There was a photo I think I shared in one of the slides that had a photo of a solar panel and a water tank and a pumping system. I guess I would mostly encourage you to look at some of the profiles. There's more details in there about the different watering systems that were in use. The fencing is a tough one. Everyone wants to have like really solid perimeter fencing. In some places that exists, and when it does, it's easier to then just go with it, and that site is sort of a better candidate because of the existence of fencing. But I know we've collectively spent a lot of time and money and effort ripping out fences in agriculture for a long time for various reasons. Sorry, not a lot for you there. Yep, there's the site. Thank you for putting it. landandmanagement.com is the easy to remember website.
Are you planning a 2.0 version of these profiles? Potentially using another group or going back and following up with the initial groups that you worked with?
I would love to. I'd love to go back to some of the sites that were still in development that weren't quite ready to have the profile and the interview. I already have a bunch of those on a list somewhere. I'd also love to do a land trust version of this. I think there's a few land trusts who are experimenting with this, and there's room to do more. But you know, it's an idea, and I'd have to find funding, and that's a challenge.
Any last words of wisdom for the group, Greg?
From all I heard from these people who are these agency staff around the country using Grazing, they're really excited about this. They really feel like it's working and helping them achieve their goals. And the idea of using less mowing, less chemicals, really resonated for a lot of them. The benefits for the birds and the stories about birds coming back and increasing numbers and species they hadn't seen is certainly, anecdotally compelling. But I think they would also be people who would, they want this to succeed. They want others to be able to try this and find it. So on their behalf, I would open the door for any of you to reach out to any of them and ask your questions and get their advice and try some things.
How many, if any, of these programs or people you worked with, did they use any government programs to get money for fencing and watering systems and that kind of thing? Or is it all through just the agency and the producer or livestock person?
I would say some of them got government money. A lot of them used agency funding. I think very little was left on the grazing partner, if anything. Maybe some of the installation and some of the labor part.
Great question. Always tricky finding the funding.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Greg. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing all these great profiles with us and what you've learned and the lessons learned from others. I think there's a lot that could be found within the public land grazing community. And to hammer home what you said, which we heard a lot yesterday too, communication is key, and then also reach out to your peers for advice. And because I think everybody's willing to share what they've learned. We're kind of all in this together. So thank you, Greg. Really appreciate you taking the time. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and Jane is going to play some waiting room music for you all to listen to. Everyone's going to stay here, and then we will return at 2:15 for our next presentation from Greg Hoke and Kelly Anderson and her husband Bill. We're going to talk about grazing in Minnesota, lessons learned there. And as Greg put in the chat, there will be a lot of that quantitative information that y'all are looking for as well. And that, so thank you again, Greg Horner. There's so many Gregs for presenting today, and we'll see everybody back here at 2:15.